Perfect. Welcome everyone to the next event in our Cougar Career Academy series. This event is entitled, Oops, I Was on Mute, Interviewing Skills in the Digital Age, if I can speak. A couple of housekeeping items for you before we begin the presentation. You are muted and unfortunately cannot unmute yourselves. That's just to kind of help with the ease of the presentation. However, as you have discovered, you can use the chat here in Zoom to communicate with me, the host, Kimberly, who is our presenter, or with fellow participants, although we would prefer that you keep communication with fellow participants to a minimum, just so that we can keep an eye out for questions that you may have during the course of the presentation. So that being said, if you have any questions, feel free to chat either to host, which is me, or to everyone. I'm going to keep an eye on the chat while Kimberly is presenting, and if you have a question while she's speaking, I can go ahead and ask her that during the presentation, but we will also leave some time at the end for a Q&A if you would prefer to ask at the end. This presentation is being recorded. A link to the event will be emailed to you after it has been taken place. And you can also follow that link there, alumlc.org/WSU/archive, to find a list of all of our past event recordings, as well as this one. I believe I should be able to upload it by this afternoon. Thank you everyone who has already introduced themselves over the chat. Looks like we have people from all over Washington and some outside of Washington across the US, so we're very happy that you're here. So today our presenter is Kimberly Carper. She is an HR consultant for KCHR Consulting LLC. I'm just going to read a brief introduction for her before she begins her presentation. So Kimberly Carper brings over 20 years of human resource management experience from Expedia, Hyatt Hotels, and Washington Mutual. She guest lectures for multiple colleges at WSU and has been an adjunct faculty member in the Carson College of Business. During her career, Kimberly has partnered with CEOs to build and sustain their organizations, created a leadership development team for Washington Mutual from the ground up, and worked with hundreds of individuals as they negotiated job transitions. Currently, Kimberly owns KCHR Consulting, providing a full range of customized consulting services for individuals looking for assistance with job searches, career strategies, interview and coaching, and salary negotiations. She also contracts to the city of Pullman, hiring for the police and fire departments. The key for her when personally looking to take on new professional challenges, finding roles that are fun, meaningful, and where she is surrounded by people who love what they do, work hard, play hard, and love to laugh. So with that, I'm gonna go ahead and turn the time over to Kimberly. Thank you so much for being willing to present for us today.
Absolutely. All right. So unfortunately, the screen sharing we did before didn't end up working. So give me a quick second here. There we go. Okay. So first of all, welcome everybody. As I put this on screen share, you probably have your panes over on the right-hand side, and they may get a little bit in the way of the presentation. So just a quick little tip, if you kind of hover over that, up at the top, you'll see like a little thing that says hide thumbnail video or show small active speaker screen. So you can adjust it however works for you. I'm gonna go ahead and hide the thumbnail video because I don't wanna watch myself because that's not exactly the best. I found that's not the best thing for me. So in any case, we're going to go ahead and get started. I don't have to do too much of an introduction because Amber told you lots of different stuff. But yes, I do have over 25 years of experience in human resources in a variety of organizations. I've also taught at the Carson College of Business, and I do have my own consulting firm. And as she mentioned, I also hire for the fire and police departments, which as you can imagine is very interesting right now as well. So lots of things going on. And I was asked to do this particular presentation, and I thought, yeah, we need this so much because honestly, video interviews or virtual interviews were really becoming quite popular before the COVID-19, right? So before the pandemic. And what was happening is people were using it to save money. If they were kind of doing general first sort of screening interviews, maybe they would do a video interview from, so they didn't have to bring somebody in. Or sometimes it just was a matter of convenience, and sometimes their interviewers were in different places and people were getting more comfortable with the technology. If they weren't comfortable with the technology, they better be now. Because basically now, that's the way that almost everybody's interviewing. And that was already the trend. It just got accelerated, right? So some of you in the initial comments says things like, I just think this is the trend of where it's going to be happening. And I cannot agree more. I do believe that more and more people will be doing virtual interviews. It's easier if someone's out of town, not bringing them in, especially if it's like a quick half-hour interview. There will be in-person interviews, but I think for a couple of different reasons, either, like I said, location, or also just as things start to open up, I think a lot of candidates will be offered the option of, are you comfortable coming in? Or would you rather do a virtual? And that's going to be okay either way. One other quick note, as Amber mentioned, with questions, while I can't see the questions as you're typing them, if you do have questions throughout, please do not hesitate. I am more than happy. Amber will just let me know what you've written. And if it's something I'm addressing later, I'll let you know. But feel free to type questions when they come to mind. So what we're going to cover today is we're going to talk about general interview preparation, because I think I'd be amiss to only just talk about, like, here's the things you need to know for virtuals. I think it's really important to understand in general some of the things you need to prepare for, whether it's a regular interview in person or a virtual interview. We're going to talk very specifically about things you have to think about. I know someone mentioned earlier, I want to help figure out the mistakes I make in tech. Oh, believe you me, I have seen the mistakes. And so we'll talk about some of those, and then we'll talk about just general interview tips. So we'll cover a little bit of everything. So to get started, I want to just talk about pre-interview. So no matter what kind of interview you're going to be having, there's a couple of details you should ask. You're not always going to get the answers, but I think it's perfectly okay to ask. So one of the things you're going to ask is, who am I interviewing with? There's a couple of reasons for this. One is, it's kind of nice to know if this is a one-on-one interview or if you're walking into or zooming into a panel interview, right? Sometimes I've seen candidates, become a little bit kind of off their game because they walk in and there's 6 of us sitting there. And they weren't really prepared for that. So it's better to know, so you can kind of think about that from a strategy standpoint. And how long is it going to be? It gives you a feel for, okay, this is going to be a pretty extensive, they're planning on about an hour. Or it's more like, oh, it'll probably be about a 20, 25-minute interview. It just sort of helps you as you're there thinking about, how long am I going to be here? How long are my answers going to be? Those types of things. And then you need to research the company. And part of the thing that you can research is, if you find out who you're interviewing with, you can actually research those individuals as well. And we'll talk later about how that can really come in handy if you have effectively researched who you're going to be talking to, because you can use those in your questions later on. And then researching the company. Excuse me, I have very, very bad allergies, so I apologize. Pollen has gotten to me. In researching a company, what's really important is, sure, finding out the history, making sure you know what they do, the kinds of markets they're in, but also think about it right now in terms of how has the pandemic hit them, right? So you're walking into a company, if you're interviewing, let's say, with like a Hyatt Hotels, that's a very different world than if you had been walking into that place in January, right? Or talking with them in January. Let's talk about a school district. You need to be aware of the kinds of things that have hit them. Talk about any kind of manufacturing company, what kind of things have hit them. So really understanding, everybody right now, all companies, all organizations are putting out on their sites things about what they're doing in COVID, what their policies are, what they're doing for their employees, what they're doing for their customers. So make sure that what you're researching is not just the history, but how things are going now and things that might be important or might come up in your interview. And then you need to be prepared. I know that sounds obvious, but I cannot tell you how many interviews I've done where people aren't prepared. So know your resume. Again, that kind of sounds silly, but when you look at your resume, you want to be able to know things on there and have refreshed it. It might not be that you've looked at it in a while. And so there's nothing worse than someone saying, so the project that you worked on when you were with Washington Mutual that increased customer service surveys by 20%, tell me a little more about that. You're like, yeah. Okay, did you write your resume or did somebody else write it for you, right? And I always tell that to my clients as well, because when I work with individual clients and we work on their resumes, we reword stuff a lot, and they just need to be familiar and remind themselves of what they landed on for their final wording, so nothing looks like it came as a surprise. And then I have something on here that says rehearse, 3 positive, 3 negative. We're going to talk about this a lot more at the end of the presentation. But when I say that, what I'm asking you to think about is 3 things in your work career, or if you're recently graduated, in your school career, whatever it might be, that you're super proud of. And we'll talk about how you rehearse those situations, but 3 things you're super proud of and 3 things you'd probably do differently. So that's part of your preparation, and we'll talk about that again a little bit more towards the end of the presentation today. But it is critical. People who go in and wing it, some people are really good at going in and winging it, but some people aren't. And in general, when a question comes up, if you haven't prepared, even if it's not for that specific question, we can see it. And it's much better to at least have prepared something so that you'll be ready to answer. And again, we'll talk about that more. So those are general pre-interview tips for whether it's an in-person interview, a phone interview, a virtual interview by video. Let's get more into some of the specifics about what makes virtual interviews unique. And there's really kind of 3 categories I put this into: the technology, the look, we'll talk about that, and the location. So let's start with technology. So technology. What you really need to do is, if you can, you need to do a practice run of your technology. So I say if you can, simply because common ones are Zoom. Obviously, Zoom has become super common. Skype, sometimes FaceTime still, Google Hangouts. Those are some of the ones that are a little bit more popular. Those are ones you can test. And we'll talk about why you need to test them. There are some companies that use places, actually several, that use places like WebEx or RingCentral, which you may not have, so you can't test that exact technology. That being said, if you can test it with the exact technology, if you can't, you still want to do a practice run. So what are you doing in a practice run? What are you checking for? You're checking for, you're doing it with a friend. And I actually did this on Saturday for today, and I actually did it again about a half hour before we started because the lighting and things had changed because it's a brighter day than it was on Saturday. So you want to kind of check out multiple things. You're going to be checking out your audio. Can your friend that you're testing this with hear you clearly? Are you cutting out? Is your video, how's your internet speed? So you're checking that, making sure that that's okay. And then again, we'll talk about the look and what you want to do to present yourself. So test that with a friend as well. Those are some of the main things you want to do to test. But what you also want to make sure is that your name is professional, right? So all of you notice, like, you all have your names on your screen right now. So is it a professional name? I absolutely have people who have used things that are not. Do you have, you probably saw, a lot of times, like with Zoom, you can have a blank screen or a profile picture. So you saw my profile picture that was on there. Other people do fun pictures as well. Is it professional? Because they will probably see that when you log in. They may see that right away. So is that all professional as well? The other thing to make sure of is if you share a computer, sometimes the last person who was on it, you may accidentally log in as them. I have a friend who does this all the time. We have a virtual book club, and like she'll log in and it'll say Seamus the Mamus, which is her son. It's just his thing that he uses for his Zoom. And if she hasn't like made sure that she's actually the one signing in, that's how she shows up. Fine for a book club, not so great for a virtual interview. Make sure your device is fully charged so that you're ready to go. Make sure that you close all other tabs, applications, anything you have going on in the background. Because there are times, I've had this happen actually not that long ago, excuse me, somebody had something in the background that all of a sudden started playing a video out of literally nowhere. I mean, it was like a poltergeist type thing. And so all of a sudden you just had this like loud, really freaky thing going on in the background for noise. And she was like, oh, I'm sorry, and trying to find it. So close everything. The other thing is put your phone in silent. I actually turned my phone off completely. And Amber and I were talking about this right beforehand. I turned it off entirely simply because I can silence it. But, and ironically, Amber, I didn't even think with your name, but the Amber alerts that come out that override pretty much everything and are loud and blaring, if you just turn off your phone, you're not going to have to deal with any of that. So I do recommend your phone is, at the minimum, it's silent. If you're comfortable turning it off completely, okay? Amber, I'm going to move forward. Any questions so far? You can just shake your head. Okay. All right, the look. So this is so hard, right? So first we look at lighting. Ideally, you're going to be in front of a window. So when you look down at the pictures below, excuse me, there's an overhead light. It's fine. The side light tends to do a lot of shadows, or direct bright light is probably the best. You have to make sure you're not too washed out. But ideally, the lighting is going to be in front of you. And if you can, like I said, putting a window that's really just right behind your computer is ideal. We don't all have that situation. I don't have that situation. But you try to do the best that you can. And like I said, test it out. Lighting above or from the back or to the side really does cast shadows. And that can be very distracting. If you want to add a lamp, which some people do, to light it up a little more, it's best to put the lamp right behind your computer. And sometimes some people have like ring lamps, which are made specifically for this. Or you might have, like my camera has a ring little light, but I find that particular one doesn't do anything. So again, if you're going to add a lamp, you want to do it directly behind the computer, but ideally natural light is the best. Another thing to think about with the look is your placement of your computer, right? So in this particular place, we get to really check out if the guy has trimmed his nose hairs, right? Because he's really got it too low. The camera's too low. I apologize. The camera is just too low. And so that's kind of an awkward view. If it's too high, we're kind of looking down on you, or you might get cut off. So ideally, you're going to have it so that you're looking slightly up, right? So for me, my camera is actually right here. So that kind of gives you, I'm looking just a little bit up into my camera. And as much as you can, you want to talk into the camera. It's not possible probably all the time, and you can see I glance down at things. But you try to talk into the camera to make it as natural as possible so that I am talking directly to you. You can see the difference as if I talk while watching the other people I'm talking to with, or if I'm kind of watching my Zoom people on the screen or I'm watching them. It's a very different feel when I'm answering a question than if I'm looking directly into the camera. And the other thing is you'd like to leave the top 10 to 20% of your screen empty. For some of you, if you're on a phone right now, I may not look like I have that. It sometimes shows up differently on a phone, but when you're looking at yourself through your camera on your laptop or your PC, whatever, you want to try to have 10 to 20% of the screen above you empty. And clothing wise, you want to avoid bright colors and patterns. Like this is not the time to try out the fuchsia tie. For some reason, they appear much more distracting in an actual virtual interview. I don't know what the real reason for that is. I think because when you're in person, there's other things that you're looking at around. But when you're doing a virtual interview, really all you're looking at pretty much is me. We'll talk about background in a minute, but you're pretty much focused just on me. And so if there's something super bright or heavily patterned, oftentimes it tends to be a distraction. Fully dressed. I know that sounds funny. I know you guys know what I'm talking about because it's become much more popular to talk about like what you're wearing in a Zoom call nowadays. But this is a problem, and I have seen it before people became really aware of it. I had a situation one time where we were doing an interview and the guy's dog came in, and he had a suit on, he had a tie, he jumped up to get the dog and then turned to walk and put the dog out of the room, and he was wearing boxer shorts. No joke. Right? So it does absolutely happen. And the funniest thing is I was about to tell that story in one of my classes at the Carson College of Business. And I had a student would be like, wait, this happened to me. I'm like, wait a minute, share. And she said, well, I was interviewing and it was a video interview and I was really nicely dressed and I was wearing pajama bottoms. I'm like, okay. And she said, and they asked me to stand up, which I have never heard before. But she said they actually asked her to stand up. She stood up and she said, I thought really quickly and I was like, professional on the top, party on the bottom. So in reality, she actually got the job because they thought she was pretty quick thinking, but she's like, I will never do that again. The other thing with really being fully professionally dressed is you feel more professional, right? When you're fully professionally dressed, you feel just the same way you would go into a in-person interview. And so you tend to keep a more professional demeanor. The other thing in terms of the look is when you're working with your lighting and you're working with all of that, if you wear glasses, glare tends to be a problem. So you need to make sure that there's no lighting that is shining off your glasses because you will get a glare and that will be extremely distracting. All right. So moving on from kind of the general look, location.
I have a question very quickly for you.
Yeah, absolutely. What's up,
Mark Dinges, one of the participants on here, was asking if you could take a look at some of the videos that you see, and he volunteered for this to see how they look in comparison to those points that you just mentioned.
I'm sorry, could you repeat that? I didn't quite.
Sure. Mark volunteered to have you critique his video based on the points you just mentioned.
Absolutely. Meaning what I'm looking at right now, Mark? Okay. Thank you, Mark, because I will tell you something. You made me think of something that's really important. I'm going to use you as a guinea pig. Okay. So first of all, I think Mark's lighting is great. I think that his clothing is good and the way that he is positioned is really good. I'm going to show you the problem with the virtual background. Mark, can you wave to me? Okay. What do you guys see happening? Wave. Move your head a little bit, Mark. Okay, that's not too bad, but it kind of depends. Your hand you may have seen, do the hand again, Mark, kind of bring it up and around. Okay. There we go. It did a little bit. Basically, sometimes when you're using any kind, that's a virtual background, I assume. Yes, Mark? Yes. Okay. So when you're using a virtual background, there are some backgrounds more than others where you will lose parts of your body. So it did a little bit with his hands. That one's not too bad. A lot of times it's when they're darker. But when you move your head sometimes or things, you will create a shadow, or you will lose a part of your body that will just kind of go black. It depends on if you have a true green screen or not. So be careful of virtual backgrounds. And Mark, it's almost like I planted you there because I meant to talk about virtual backgrounds here, but you started it. So there you go. So virtual backgrounds can be good, but I do see them cause problems where you do end up kind of having part of your body disappear. And And I will say, if you're going to play with your Zoom and do virtual backgrounds and things, don't do the upside down one. That's just like, I don't even get why that's there, except for kids to cause problems in Zoom virtual classrooms now. So, so what do you want to have with you in your location? So you want to have simple things. Now, first, actually, I'm going to back up. Where are you going to have this? So this isn't as much of an issue at this particular moment as it has been, but I have a lot of people in past and virtual interviews who, you know, they're working and so they have to step out and interview somewhere else. And they go to like a coffee shop or they go somewhere outside. It might work, but at the same time, I've had people where I had one guy sitting outside of Starbucks. And like I said, it's not as much of a problem now because there's not as many places that a lot of us, depending on what state we're in, can go to. But sitting outside and the wind became a huge problem, right? So it would just kind of blow and it was really, really difficult to hear him. So again, thinking about location, in an ideal world, you want to be in a quiet, enclosed area. I do recommend as things open up again, sometimes when people have an area where either they don't have a good background that they're going to be able to do their interview in, and we'll talk about that, or it's just going to be too noisy. Sometimes public libraries, you can use a room, or a university library. Again, for a lot of us, that's not an option right now, but those are options to consider in the future. Or you're in your own home, right? And you pick a location. We all understand that we don't all have like a location where we can have the perfect background. That's okay, but there are things to think about. So first of all, what's in the room with you in terms of on your desk, if you're doing it at, you know, work, home, whatever. When I have a pen and a pad of paper, have a copy of your resume in case you're going to look back at something, maybe some notes, if there's some notes, especially if you've done some background on the individuals, but be careful about having too many notes because as you can see, if I look down as if I had notes here and I'm checking things, it's different than when we're in the room with you. If I'm in the room with you and you're taking notes, or I'm in the room with you and you're looking at notes, I know what you're doing. When you're looking at notes and it's a virtual interview, I don't always know if you're looking at notes or if you're checking texts on your phone, right? It can become a distraction. The whole goal with the lighting, the look, the location, all of that in technology is to create a lack of distractions, right? I want it to be so that you as the interviewer are focused on me. You're not focused on what you're hearing. You're not focused on the fact that I have this huge like ball of light in the middle of my forehead. You're focusing just on me and what I'm saying. So maybe a glass of water, right? You saw I have a water bottle. I would have that normally, but I knew that was critical for me today with my allergies. The other thing is it's completely okay to take notes during an interview that's virtual, but you've got to tell them that's what you're doing, right? Because if you don't tell them that that's what you're doing, then again, it could look like you're doing, you know, you're checking your phone or doing something else. Your background needs to be neat and tidy. My background right now, ironically, is extremely neat and tidy. And unfortunately, that's because we were going to moved everything out of the house and then realized it was a bad decision. And so we haven't moved most of our house back in. But normally behind me, I would have a lot of books and things. And so you have to decide if that, you know, you think, oh, books, I look well-educated, but make sure it's not to the point where people are getting distracted trying to see the titles on the books or, you know, depending on what kind of titles, whether they're appropriate books. So you have to kind of be careful of that in terms of what's behind you, but simple is good. Something simple, neat, tidy. Please don't do it in your bedroom with your bed behind you. I know that sounds like, well, okay, I'd put up a virtual or something, but I had an interview. This was for the police department. It was not a police officer, it was another role. And this woman who was very professional, she did a really nice job, but she was sitting like at her computer and she had her bed right behind her. And it just felt weird. And as soon as we finished the interview and it was a panel and we started to talk, The first thing I was like, oh my gosh, I couldn't believe she was doing that in her bedroom. I was like, oh yeah, that was just felt really weird, like being in her bedroom. Yeah, that was so strange that her bed was right behind. And that's all they were talking about. They weren't talking about the answer she had given because it had been a complete distraction. So again, try to avoid doing it, with your bed behind you. Alerting other people who are living with you that you are doing an interview and that you cannot be disturbed, or wherever you might be. That's extremely important. We can't avoid everything. Things do happen. But you want to be sure to let people know that you're going to be doing an interview. You can't be interrupted. I have my husband who works from home. I have my children here. I did tell them all, and then I just went ahead and stuck a sticky note on the door that says, do not come in unless there is a fire. Because sometimes telling teenagers that you are busy isn't always enough. So again, I think putting a sticky note on the door to remind your roommates, to remind your partner, to remind your family, if you can put the dog somewhere else, if it's going to bark, try to do as much as you can to minimize that and alert people in your home. During the interview itself, go ahead and log in early. It's just like a regular interview where in person where you're going to show up early. I'd say about 5 minutes early for logging in just to make sure that you can log in okay. I actually went to go log into this one. Amber and I were going to be meeting 15 minutes before. I use Zoom every day, and there was like this weird glitch. And so I thought, oh, good grief, what am I going to do? And so, but I had time to overcome that. Zoom, as you may have noticed, you might have run into this, Zoom is doing a lot of updates a lot of the time. And if you haven't been on, or even, if you haven't gone ahead and logged in beforehand, and that I would recommend just making sure your Zoom or your Skype, I say Zoom because that's what a lot of people are using, but make sure it's working, or make just sure in general that your computer doesn't have to do updates. The problem, if a computer has to do updates, you can delay those. So if it's, they're using WebEx or Ring and you have computer updates, you can just say, okay, that's fine, I'll wait. Zoom will force you to use it, and I think Skype will force you as well. And so it just depends on how long those take. So log in a little bit early. And then I would recommend potentially, if you're comfortable, asking them for a phone number if there are technical issues, because it could be technical issues on your end or on their end. And so just saying, I'm really excited to be here. And I was just wondering if there are any technical issues on either end. Is there a phone number I should call to reach somebody, just so that I can call you back? So asking for a phone number is completely appropriate, and it's okay. A lot of times, yes, your interviewer is going to have your phone number, but sometimes they don't, and you'd hate to just have something cut off and then not be able to reach them. It is also completely okay to let them know if you cannot see them or hear them well. Some people are thinking, well, I can make it through this, like it'll be okay. And then you don't quite catch a question, or you're asking, oh, I'm sorry, can you repeat that? Wait, I'm sorry, could you repeat that? I once did an interview, and this is not a joke, and I feel like this one's going to stay with me forever. This is a woman who interviewed from her workplace. We had wanted to do it by WebEx, but she really wanted to do it by FaceTime. So we're like, okay, fine, we can do FaceTime. So she's on her phone doing it by FaceTime. She's gone somewhere in her work environment to a place where she can actually go ahead and talk, but she hasn't tested it at all, and she can't hear. So I don't know if she didn't put it on speaker. I don't know what she did, but she's trying to look at it, right? So she's trying to look at it, and she's trying to hear, and she can't. So what she does is when we ask a question, she does this the entire time. So anytime she's like puts her head to her phone, and so this is what we end up seeing every time we ask her a question. So, depending on your age and stuff too, in the case of Corona, this may not be so pretty. It may be lots and lots of gray up there. But she is not, we couldn't deal with it. It was awful. And she'd be like, what? I'm sorry, I can't hear you. Just let us know that at the beginning. We finally did end up saying, we're just going to do this by phone. But don't try to fake it through, because she tried to kind of fake it in the beginning and we couldn't figure out what was going on. If you can't see him or hear him well, you can say, I'm sorry, I'm having trouble hearing. Let me just check. Is it my volume? Is it you? a lot of times it's just that they're not being picked up well. So it's okay to tell them that. And we already talked about this, but looking at the camera lens as opposed to looking at the people that you're actually talking to there, because this actually looks like I'm looking at you instead.
Kimberly, I have a follow-up question on note-taking.
Yes.
When is the best time to mention to the interviewer about note-taking? Sometime at the beginning of the interview, as in, is it okay that I take a note, or while you're taking the note?
You know, that's a great question. I tend to prefer, for me personally, I tend to tell people, and I tend to say, you know, I'd like to take some notes. Is that okay? So that's perfectly fine. Or is it okay if I take notes? But in a virtual interview, the difference with that, I do think it's professional to ask in the beginning. But the difference is, if then when you go to take your notes, it's okay to say, that's great. Hold on one second. I want to make note of that because I really want to remember that. Or that's great. Can I just take a quick note? So that you are telling them what you're doing. But I think telling them in the beginning is also a very good idea. Thanks, Amber. The other thing is, be really careful of delays. So if you've ever tried to sing happy birthday, like let's say over Zoom or over Skype with anybody, you know that there's delays, right? And so there's a couple things to think about. Don't jump in to answer a question because they may be continuing and there might have just been a delay. So just wait a couple seconds to make sure the question's finished before you start to answer. Also, when you finish a question, you may want to go ahead and say, you know, you may want to do some sort of thing that sort of indicates that you've ended it. So you say, you know, and so that's how we resolved it. I'm hoping that fully answers your question. Now, you're not going to say that every time, because if you say, I hope that fully answers your question every time, that's going to get annoying. But you might want to just kind of nod so they know that you haven't frozen, right? So making sure that at the end of a question, you might say, and then that way it's your way of indicating that you've finished your question. Try to avoid touching your face. One of the things, and this is bad if you look at yourself, a lot of times people tend to like play with their hair. I'm really guilty of that on calls. Like, so, you know, I'm kind of looking at myself and I'll wait my hair. Maybe not that obvious, but even just doing little things like this can become very distracting. So try not to touch your face. The other thing, I hope you've noticed, I've done it purposefully a couple of times. Maybe you've noticed that I do gesture, and that's okay. But if I tend to gesture a lot, like what happens? If I gesture close, my hand becomes huge, right? So gestures need to stay close to your body, because otherwise you become kind of this like just weird sense of distraction. My husband was actually on a call yesterday and he came in and he's like, you've got to mention this tomorrow. This guy who was presenting, he kept doing this. And then at the end of doing this, every time, and he would do it constantly, he would put his hands down on his desk. So he'd be talking and making a point and be like, and so, you know what I mean by saying that. And he said it was just horrible. So again, hand gestures are natural and normal. I can't talk without my hands. You can't always see them because they're a little lower, but you've got to keep them close to you, not close to a camera. Watching your speed, making sure. I was on a call, I was on a presentation the other day, and it was a panel presentation. And one of the women, honestly, she would talk like this the entire time, and I'm usually pretty good at understanding what people say, but I was having the hardest time keeping up with her, and I was getting absolutely exhausted. And so you have to make sure that your pace is something that with delays, I can follow you, not talking too fast. That follows for an in-person or for a virtual interview. But the other thing that is, it's important for in-person and for virtual, but it is so critical for virtual interviews, is to smile when you're listening. I was on another panel presentation where one of the women, when she was not talking, this was her. I honestly thought she'd been frozen. She never was, because when it was her time to talk, she would move, but she would do this. And she looked like miserable. And then she was animated when she talked, but then, so you want to smile, you want to acknowledge, you want to nod so they know you haven't frozen. But here's the other key piece. One of the things we tend to naturally do when acknowledging people in person is, you know, Amber makes a comment and I'm like, If I do that in a virtual interview, I cut them off. It's the whole delay issue. So you actually need to avoid oral or whatever. You can't do any kind of noise as an acknowledgement because you're going to cut off your speaker. So it just has to be kind of nods or just those kinds of things, you know, maybe a little bit of a shift or something, but try not to say, oh yeah, okay, because you're going to cut them off. You're going to miss what they're saying. They're going to think you're trying to say something. They're going to stop. It gets awkward really fast. So be careful. The other thing is your posture, keeping your back straight, kind of keeping your shoulders open. I highly recommend that you keep your feet on the floor. It tends to help you sit up straighter. You want to have your hands either on a desk in front of you or on the chair, hands of your chair. Again, just kind of keeping yourself straight. The idea, again, not distracting. I'm not paying attention to the fact that you tend to sit like this. I'm not, you know, you're just sitting straight and it just becomes a non-issue. All right. Amber, any other questions before I move on? Okay. So the other things during the interview to really think about, and these apply to all interviews, are always staying positive and professional, okay? Right now, we have companies that have laid people off. We've had situations that have not been great. You still have to stay positive and professional. You don't say anything negative about a company or a person ever. There's one exception, and I'll tell you that. But you don't want to badmouth a past boss. You just don't know who knows who, right? And it just doesn't make you look good. I don't care if you left a company because of the fact that it was a discriminatory environment or anything like that. That's not what you should be telling me. You have to find another reason in terms of it wasn't the right fit for you or whatever, but you can't be bad-mouthing other companies. The one time that things are negative is when I ask you a question to tell me about something negative, right? Then you can't be like, oh, I've never had that happen before. Everything in my life has always been great, because I am asking you to tell me something that was dealing with a difficult person or whatever. But the way that you phrase it is there's going to be some sort of a learning from it. So we're going to have something positive as the end outcome, even though I'm talking about a negative situation. But again, that should only come up when I'm asking you to describe a failure, a challenge, a difficult person. It shouldn't be something when I ask you why you left the last company, you're like, oh my gosh, my boss was such a micromanager. I just couldn't do it. I need to be able to spread my wings and do my own thing. Like, no, thank you. I don't want you to go badmouth me when you leave my company. So really, key things to think about. The other thing is to have prepared questions. That's where you probably have notes. And so it's completely okay in a virtual interview when they say, well, do you have any questions for me? Yes, you know, as a matter of fact, I do. Let me just grab my notes. Completely appropriate. And then I know you're going to be looking down at questions, because that also tells me, hey, wait a minute, you prepared. And so that's actually a positive. Questions, good versus bad questions. Good questions are things like, if you've researched actual individuals, to be able to say, well, Susan, I see that you've been here. She looks up really quickly like, what? Susan, I see that you've been at the company for 15 years. What are some of the biggest changes you've seen in your time here? Right? So things that show that you have gone ahead and researched them. Things that show that you've researched the company. One of the things I always tell is when I went to Expedia, before I went there, I did actually an informational interview. And someone told me that the person who was the head of Expedia, the HR person, she always asked this question to everybody when it was a regular interview, which was, how do you think Expedia was affected by 9/11? Right? That's a really hard question to try to answer, right? And I can see that kind of thing with COVID now as well. So I was doing an informational interview, so it was not for a job at that point. So I was doing an informational interview. I decided to preempt it. So when I went to go ask her one of my questions, I said, So I know that 9/11 had to have a huge impact on Expedia as it would all of the travel industry. I'd love to hear about some of the ways that you worked as an organization to overcome those challenges. A, I didn't have to answer the question. And B, she's like, wow, she's really thinking about the company. So things like that, asking questions. Another question you can always ask of any company would be, tell me a little bit, I'd love to hear a little bit about the company culture. Or what do you like best about working here? Or what do you find as some of the biggest challenges in your role? Those are okay things to kind of ask. Or what are you most excited about for the organization in the next 2 years? What do you think some of the biggest challenges are going to be? Those are good types of questions, right? And specific questions about the role. What are you looking for? You know, what are the top qualities that the person you hire for this role is going to have? Those are good questions. Bad questions, salary, benefits, vacation. Those kinds of things are not the things that you are going to ask in an interview. They're going to come up later, probably after you have the job offer or possibly in a one-on-one with an HR person, because those are things you need to know inside and out before you ever accept a job. You don't want to get surprised by that. There are also negotiation points. But when you ask about the salary range or you ask about vacation or benefits in a first interview, it completely distracts us and makes us think, well, they only care about the money. I'd rather you care about the company and what we do and believe in our mission and want to know what it's like to work here. But if you're only in it for the money, you might as well go work anywhere else. So that's kind of an idea in terms of things that you want to ask versus what you don't want to ask, right? A couple more quick things before we wrap up. Behavioral interviews are hugely, hugely popular. Sorry, Amber, did you have a question that you wanted to share?
We did on that last slide really quickly. If interviewees are not supposed to talk negative about why they are leaving, why do interviewers ask that question? Is it meant to be a test?
We ask the question. I don't ask the question. Well, no, actually, sometimes I do. We ask the question because we do want to know. It's about how you phrase it, right? So being able to say, you know, I've been in the role and it wasn't just challenging, or the role was very different than what I believed it was going to be coming into it, or the company culture wasn't as good of a fit for what I wanted. I need to work somewhere that I really believe strongly in what we do. Those are okay. My boss was a jerk. You know, I got completely harassed. I went to HR 5 times and they wouldn't do anything about it. Like, those are the kinds of things I don't want to hear, because I'd rather hear that you left because the environment wasn't a good fit. And I hate to say this because there are things that are like really major reasons that we should leave a company. But when you bring that up, the first thing that goes to a lot of people who are interviewing minds is this a problem employee, right? Especially if you've left a couple of companies and you haven't stayed places very long, then I really start to think about that. So there are ways that you can phrase it. And I'll offer this up to you. You guys can see my email. If you have left an organization and you're not sure how to phrase that particular thing, let's talk. I am more than happy to just kind of listen to the situation and then kind of help you come up with your story that you'll tell that shares why you left without sounding overly negative. Okay, so I hope that helps. Great question. So behavioral interviews, these are pretty much the types of interview questions that so many companies ask now, and it's really important to know what we're looking for and how to answer them. So what it is that we believe in general that past behavior predicts future performance. So what you've done is what I'm going to expect in the future. So your clues that you're in that type of interview, if they don't tell you outright, are things like, well, tell me about a time when, or describe a time when, or tell me about a situation when. That means I am looking for something very specific that you have experienced versus you telling me what you think you would do. So it's completely normal to stop and have to think about these types of answers, right? So you're going to pause and think to project that you are present and not overly prepared. Because remember how I talked to you about, we want to prepare 3 things we're really proud of and 3 things we would do differently. What happens is, if you've got those 6 scenarios, you can most likely adapt one of them to a behavioral interview question, even if it's not exactly what you were preparing for. But what you don't want to have happen is, tell me about a time when you dealt with somebody who was challenging. Oh yeah, no, absolutely. I can tell you that right off the bat. Well, then it's like, well, wait a minute. A, you either rehearse this, or B, I dealt with a lot of challenging people and that's not a problem for you. It's okay to pause. Sometimes a pause, if you have the answer right away, sometimes a pause might be, okay, that's a really good question. Yeah, you know what, I can absolutely tell you about a time that happened. So just kind of a natural sort of like filling that in before you answer. What you don't want to say is, I think I would, or I probably would, because that's not what I'm looking for. I'm looking for a time that really happened. If you really, really, really have never had that happen to you, then you say so, but you try to, like, it's okay if you take 30 seconds to kind of try to think about something that you can adapt to that particular answer. And be specific and use facts. So again, when I'm asking you a behavioral interview question, I don't want generalizations. And so every time that happened, we would do something like, no, I want one time. So even if it has happened a bunch of times, try to focus on one that's specific. And again, like I said, you want to have it rehearsed, because sometimes you can really mess yourself up. If not, perfect example, an interview that I once had, they asked me a question and I had an answer, but I was kind of winging it. And I'm usually really good at winging it, but I was winging it. And so I had to talk about a particular customer. And so I decided to give him a name as I started talking. And so I said to him, Mr. Rogers. And then, because I knew I was making that up, it sounded ridiculous to me, because all I could think of was Mr. Rogers from Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. So I said to him, Mr. Rogers, and then I paused and I kind of got myself caught up. And I'm a very professional interviewer, so I got myself cut off and I said, take off that sweater. And then I kept going, but it was because I thought that I felt like they knew that I was making it up because the name sounded so ridiculous, which it didn't, but I just wasn't prepared enough. And so said something stupid. So if you're someone who's interviewed a ton of times and you can still do stuff like that, I highly recommend that you prepare no matter how strong you are at interviewing. And here's how your answers go. You want to answer in what's called a STAR format, because that's what I'm looking for. I'm looking for you to tell me in a brief, concise way the situation, what your task was, what the goal was, what the action was that you took, and the results. So again, this is where I was, this is what I needed to do, this is what I did, and this is how it turned out. When you say the action, you want to focus on you, even if it was kind of a group situation. I remember one where a woman was talking about a time that she had to go to human resources about a problem. And it was all about, we did this and we did that and we did this. And what we couldn't figure out, and what I kept wondering as she was talking, was whether A, she really had any active part in this, or if she was just part of a bigger group, or B, if she was telling me somebody else's story. It was kind of hard for me to know. So again, focusing on what you did, what your part was in it, and then the result, making it a positive. So even if it's a question that is kind of looking for something that's been challenging or difficult, those positives are things like what you learned from it, what you would do differently next time. That's how you turn it into a positive, in terms of thinking about, well, this is what I learned, or this is what I would do differently, or if I had to do it over and I thought about this, or this is how I'll approach it in the future. So that's how you can turn some of those negatives into a positive. But again, if you can prepare 3 things you're super proud of in a STAR format, and 3 things that you wish you'd done differently or weren't quite as great, you can adapt those to a lot of different questions that we might throw your way. So finally, I just wanted to give you a couple of the typical tough questions. You can Google tough interview questions. You'll find ones like these and others. Some of them I hate, like, what is your biggest weakness? To me is just like, I don't know what you're going to say that's ever going to wow me. A lot of people tend to take, I'm just a perfectionist and I can't, that one's overused. Don't use it. But these are some sets of questions where if you can kind of think about these types of things, that will also help you to prepare. So that's pretty much all that I had for you today. Looks like timing wise, we're pretty good. This is my information as well. You do have my phone number and you do have my email. So again, if you need help kind of thinking about, this is why I left this company, I am happy to just help out. Or if there's anything I can do for you in the future. Oh, Amber, questions that we might have. I know we don't have a ton of time, but.
Yes. So I'm not seeing any new ones in the chat right now. If you have a really pressing question that you want to get in before we close, please ask it now. Again, like I said, this has been recorded, so we'll post it online and I'll email that to you once it's been uploaded so that you can take a look. So Kimberly, I'll just ask one question while we're waiting for some to come in. What do you think makes a potential employee really stand out on a virtual interview? What's something that you said, wow, they really nailed it because of this?
Honestly, I would say it's the research. If someone has really looked into my company and looked into, so I'll take the police department, right? And we do virtual interviews for the police department. We do virtual interviews for the fire department. So one of the questions we will ask is, what do you know about the Pullman Fire Department? If you've really looked into things, then I'm going to be impressed. Or if when you ask me a question, it relates directly to things that we've done or things that have happened, or things that you can find out about us on our website, that to me is really what makes people stand out. And just being professional and prepared. But again, the research thing is a lot of times what makes the difference. I mean, obviously you have to have really good answers to your questions, but if I can tell that you've really looked into it, you stay engaged, a virtual interview again, I guess I would say with a virtual interview, it's not as much like what makes you stand out other than what I'm talking about in terms of answers, but the virtual piece is when you don't have distractions. That's what makes you a stronger candidate, because I actually focus on you and then I'm hearing about your research and I'm hearing about your questions. If I get distracted, unfortunately, by any other thing that's going on, whether it's your fault or not, oh, sorry, that made me just think of something too. Sorry, whether it's your fault or not, then it's harder for me to rate you as highly. But what I was going to say is there are some things we cannot avoid, right? So let's say that you are doing a virtual interview and there is noise. So a dog barks and there's like nothing you could do about that, or a car alarm goes off outside. You want to acknowledge that. So you do want to say, I am so sorry, there's a car alarm going off. Can you still hear me okay? Or if you've got to go take care of a dog that's going to just cause a ruckus, it is okay to say, I'm really sorry. There seems to be something going on with my dog. Please give me one moment. Or there's something going on with my child or whatever. Could you please give me one moment? Mute yourself and step out of the screen to address it and then come back. So if someone does come in, your roommate comes in, rather than having that conversation with them right there, say, I'm so sorry, please give me just one moment. Mute it, step away, and then come back.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Okay, and then I think we'll just have one more before we end. If your job has been cut due to COVID, is it okay to be honest about that in an interview?
Absolutely. Yeah, it is absolutely okay. If you've been furloughed or if you've been, unfortunately, the organization was was really struggling. And so they had to eliminate positions due to the pandemic. Absolutely.
Perfect. Okay, great. Okay, it looks like we do have a couple more coming through. I know we're a little over time, but these might be pretty easy to answer.
No problem.
One is it better to have a virtual background or to sit in a tidy room?
I would prefer a tidy room unless you're sure with your virtual background that none of your body is going to disappear.
Okay.
So I personally would prefer tidy room. If you're going to use a virtual background, you just have to make sure that you're not going to fade into it at any point and that it's something that is clean and professional. If you're cool enough to do like a plain virtual background with the company's logo in it, that's kind of fun. But again, a lot of times you lose body parts and that's just awkward.
Definitely. Okay, and then the last one, regarding the STAR interview approach, can you share how to set up the situation? Also, when you say concise, can you elaborate on what that means? For example, how much time should you spend answering the question and where we should spend most of the time in our response?
Absolutely. You're putting me on the spot, but I will do that in terms of, so let's think about a project that you're super proud of accomplishing. So the situation, I would just say, well, one that really comes to mind is the first time that we needed to do an assessment center for the fire department. We had never gone outside for that. We'd never gone to an outside agency in order to facilitate that. And so I had to put together an RFP, a request for proposal, in order to really find out the best company for us. It worked out really well in that I was able to find some good examples of proposals in reaching out to other organizations, other departments in the area. Was able to reach out to 9 different companies who actually did propose on it. We got a great bid, and we had enough information to really evaluate the best company to work with us. The greatest thing about this was we went ahead, we did the assessment center, and the unanimous feedback from all of the candidates was it was the best assessment center that they had gone through, and that they felt that they were, it was really a fair and professional process, which was what our goal had been. So again, I kind of just talked about this is what we had to do. This is kind of what I ended up doing, and this was the result. It's probably, I don't know exactly how long that took, but minute and a half, but kind of that sort of an approach. Lorena, if that did not answer your question well enough, you are welcome to shoot me an email, but hopefully that was kind of an example that gave you that information.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Okay, looks like that's the end of our questions. So again, if you have any additional questions, feel free to contact Kimberly at the information up there on the screen. Thank you so much, Kimberly, for presenting for us.
Absolutely, Amber. Thanks for the opportunity, and good luck, everybody.
Perfect. Thank you, everyone. Our next Cougar Career Academy will take place on the 24th of June. So keep an eye out for registration for that. It's online on our website. And I'll post up a slide here so you can see where you can register for that as well. Thank you so much for tuning in, and we hope this was useful to you. I'll email you a link to the recording probably this afternoon. So thank you so much.
Great. Thank you, guys. Bye-bye.